You likely listen to podcasts. There are well over 100 million listeners here in the US. You also likely listen to several podcasts. The average American listens to 8 podcasts per week. As a podcast listener, you've likely wondered if you can even start your own. Then you begin to think, what will I talk about? What's the point or goal of me starting one? And is there anyone else I can get inspiration from? The answer is yes to all 3 questions. And here's the kicker. You can build a construction podcast that helps build your brand, attract talent, build client relationships, and generate you a ton of social media content. And this is what I'm covering today. I'm sharing the top 4 types of podcasts that any contractor can start building online today. And no, you don't have to be Joe Rogan either. With that said, let's begin. Before I begin breaking down each podcast type, I want to clarify something for you all. My goal with this video is to give you ideas on a podcast you can start for your construction company and not a how-to video on starting a podcast. There are so many videos out there that cover the how to start a podcast on a platform like YouTube. And one more thing before we start. Here's a quick breakdown on how I'll approach each podcast type. I'll start by sharing a fictitious podcast name that conveys what the podcast is about. Then I'll share the objective of the podcast. I'll follow that up by sharing who would ideally host the podcast. Then I'll share the potential outcomes from starting the podcast. And finally, I'll give an example of a podcast that you can get inspiration from. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's begin. The first type of podcast your construction company can start is called the internal culture building podcast. The objective with this podcast is to unite your teams across many office locations and projects by sharing where your company's at now and where it's headed in the future. Your host would be the founder, executive, or leader who would have a conversation with another leader, team member, or trades worker on a specific topic about your company. The outcome with starting this kind of podcast can be building your culture, uniting your team, having leadership presence, improving hiring efforts, and generating ideas and inspiration for social media content. The Sergeant On Track podcast is a great example of a podcast you can gain inspiration from. In their podcast, they focus on keeping their employee owners informed as they work to improve the health, wealth, and safety of their crew. And don't worry, I'll include the link to all these podcasts in the description. The second type of podcast your construction company can start is called the Trade Advocacy podcast. The objective with this podcast is to talk about your trade by highlighting its importance, challenges, and advocacy. Your host would be someone in field leadership who has a ton of field experience and great relationships with trade workers. The outcome of starting this kind of podcast can be bringing awareness to the trades and specifically your trade, uniting our industry, and generating ideas and inspiration for social media content. The Dirt Talk podcast is a great example of this kind of podcast type. In their podcast, they discuss dirt world issues, answer listener questions, and interview people from executives to operators. The third type of podcast your construction company can start is called the Business Story and Growth podcast. The objective of starting this podcast is to share stories behind building your company, including failures, successes, and everything in between. Your host would be the company's founder alongside another executive like a COO or a CFO. The outcome with starting this kind of podcast can be building awareness for your company, improving recruiting efforts, engaging prospects and customers, and generating ideas and inspiration for social media content. Turner Mining Live is a great example of a podcast you can use to gain inspiration from. In their podcast, they dig deep into the inner workings of building Turner Mining Group. And the fourth and last type of podcast that your construction company can start is called the Client Relationship Podcast. The objective of this podcast is to interview your existing, past, and potential clients in a podcast environment. Your host would be an executive or a business development manager or director with a great pulse on client relationships. The outcome of starting this kind of podcast can be improved business development efforts, strengthened relationships with clients and prospects, and ideas or inspiration for social media content. The Specified Growth podcast is a great example you can use to gain inspiration from. In their podcast, they talk to leaders and experts about how to overcome adversity, grow massive organizations, and create meaningful change in the building materials and construction industry. As a recap, you have 4 types of podcasts that you can build today. The Internal Culture Building podcast, the Trade Advocacy podcast, the Business Story and Growth podcast, and the Client Relationship podcast. Regardless of which one you choose, I believe that more contractors should strive to build a podcast of some sort. Your company needs it, your market needs it, and our industry needs it. All right, here's my question for you. What's your favorite podcast to listen to right now? Let me know down in the comments. And please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. With that said, we'll see you in the next one.